232. Chapter 5 5.18 would not have the breaking entity listed as a patient in the actional event. This is a simple way of representing the directness effect. A similar representation could be used for languages that have verbs denoting indirect causation by means of specialized causative verb affixes. 5.26. ACT. Go. Thing. Why. Property. Broken. Break. Effect. Event. Event. Ident. Thing. Thing. Why. Not only does the verb cut specify a causative meaning, the patient must end up with a cut in it, but, as mentioned in Chapter 4, the causation must have been brought about in a certain way, by moving an instrument into contact with and through the patient. Hale and Loughran, 1983. There is again some intuitive uncertainty about which events are subordinate to which other ones, but the most parsimonious theory is one where the semantic representation predicts its syntactic form. Since the patient, not the instrument, is the direct object of cut in English, there is no motivation for defining it as, to move an instrument to X, causing a cut in X. Instead, it should be, to effect a cut in X by means of moving an instrument against it. This introduces a new causal subordinating relation, means. Cognitively, the means by which an event happens is the penultimate event in a causal chain resulting in that event. Talmy, 1988. In addition, there is usually an implication that the final event in the chain is a goal of the agent, S action. Thus, X causes Y by means of Z is similar to X causes Z, which causes Y, where Y is the goal of the action. These are two ways of describing a multilinked causal chain, involving different construals of an event, one coarse-grained, one slightly finer-grained, and they can be expressed differently in language. To capture the fact that an event containing a means is being construed at a different grain size than an event embracing only the first cause and the last effect, I will label means as a distinct type of event subordinated to an action. Thus the verb cut might be represented as something like 5.27. To make the representation a bit more readable, I use real names for actors and patients. Representation 233 instead of indexes. They are in parentheses, a reminder that their actual content is not specified by the verb but for open arguments by constituents in the rest of the sentence. The representation can be paraphrased as: Bob acts on a pear, causing the pear to become cut, by means of acting on a knife, causing the knife to go against and through the pear. 5.27. ACT. Go. Go. Thing pear. Thing pear. Thing pear. Against. Property. Cut. Cut. Effect. Effect means. Event. Path. Place via through. Event. 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 Ident. Thing Bob. Thing pear. ACT. Thing Bob. Thing knife. Thing knife. 5.5.10. Linking oblique arguments. If the patient argument of the means clause in the representation for cut had been annotated with the square bracket open argument designator, we would have the lexical entry underlying the version of cut that allows an instrumental with phrase. A similar representation would underlie the version of hit that appears in John hit Bill with a stick, but it would lack the effect branch predicating a change of the patient of the hitting Bill. The preposition with would be selected in these entries by a combination of two structures enforcing linking regularities, a linking rule for oblique arguments in general, and a lexical entry for the specify C preposition. The diagrams in 5.6 showed that arguments of go or be are oblique when they are paths or places. Now that we have a feature set for basic predicates, we can unite these two linking rules. They would pertain to the second argument of less than minus control greater than predicates. A different linking rule would apply to arguments of have or ACT predicates in the class less than plus control greater than. They are linked to oblique phrases when the structure they are in is not the root event state, but embedded in a substructure of the root event. The 234. Chapter 5.2 Linking rules for oblique indirect arguments, which are listed in 5.28, must be implemented in slightly different ways, at least in languages with free prepositions, like English. For the phi-rst rule, pertaining to locative arguments of go be predicates, the entire prepositional phrase expresses the open argument. For the second rule, applying to ACT, have predicates, only the object of the prepositional phrase expresses the open argument. The difference between the two linking rules corresponds roughly to the difference between the two kinds of roles that prepositions and morphological case markers are traditionally thought to play, as semantically contentful locative functions whose meanings are composed with those of other constituents of the sentence to build the sentence interpretation, and as grammatical markers that identify their objects as bearing some semantic role with respect to the verb. See, e.g., Kaplan and Bresnan, 1982. Bresnan, 1982d. 5.28. Less than control greater than indirect internal argument plus control greater than. Event, state, thing, thing. The lexical entry for the instrumental preposition with would call for an open argument corresponding to the patient within a means substructure. It is depicted in 5.29. 5.29. With means, event, thing, X, ACT, thing, X, ACT. Representation 235 5.5.11. A family of causal relations. Given these independent mechanisms for denoting acting upon and affecting, Talmy, S. 1985, 1988 types of causal interactions can be captured explicitly. Steady state or extended causation, e.g., the ball kept rolling because of the wind acting upon it. In contrast to the onset causation we have discussed so far, can be represented by having the ACT event be a state, not an event. Such stative acts would be involved in the definitions of verbs like support, keep, suspend, occupy, and so on, where not just a spatial relationship is encoded, but the notion that some force continuously exerted by an antagonist object on an agonist is responsible for the state of the agonist. Recall that this plays a role in the fact that some verbs of spatial relationships are passivizable but others are not. See section 4.4.4. The semantic representation in 5.30 is an example. The meaning of the new subordinating causal relation, prevent, is just what its mnemonic suggests. 5.30. Support. Prevent down. State. Event. Thing Y. Thing. ACT. Path. Thing. Y. Go. Two other distinctions are naturally represented in terms of different kinds of subordinating relations. One is whether it is the result of an agent, S action, or the action itself that is focused on as the main event. The effect link is used for verbs that focus on the causing action, adding information that some other event ensues. Reversing the perspective, define NES a complementary link called cause that can be used when the focus is on the effect, and information is added that the event was caused by some antecedent agent-patient relation. The subordinating relation, cause, like the other semantic primitives I have invoked, can be encoded elsewhere in language using closed class morphemes. For example, in English it is encoded in the conjunction because and in the prepositions for in. I rewarded condemned John for his actions, and from in. She became sick from too much dancing, and perhaps verb internally in predicates such as concede, acquiesce, or relent. 236. Chapter 5. The other kind of subordinating relations are defined by whether the agent antagonist is stronger than the patient agonist, resulting in a change. If we take the cause relation but assert that the agent antagonist of the antecedent subordinated event failed to affect the inherent tendency of the patient agonist, we get a new subordinating relation that we can refer to using the mnemonic, despite. It will be found in the definition of the English conjunction of the same name, or verb internally, in the definition of verbs like resist or withstand. The fourth possible combination defined by these contrasts, reversing the perspective of despite, would consist of an agent-patient main event and a subordinate event in which a resulting effect on the patient agonist is asserted not to have occurred. This might correspond to verbs such as try or fail, and perhaps conative constructions such as John cut at the bread. Single quote. but seems like an apt mnemonic for this subordinating relation. It and despite are sometimes called concessive relations. Enabling or letting, and preventing or stopping, are two other prominent types of subordinating causal links. Letting corresponds to the cessation or non-occurrence of an agent-patient event or state, with an effect involving a moving or changing theme. Conversely, preventing corresponds to an agent-patient relation whose effect is the cessation or failure of occurrence of a moving or changing theme. A feature set such as focus on the cause or on the effect potency, antagonist succeeds in exerting its usual effect on the agonist by virtue of its greater strength, or fails, and occurrence, the cause event occurs or fails to occur, and the effect event occurs or fails to occur, could capture these causal links, as shown in 5.31. There are several reasons to believe that causal links are mentally decomposed in something like this fashion. Some languages have single devices that are indeterminate between causing and letting. Some novel causatives produced by English speakers have meanings that correspond more to letting than causing. See the examples in 4.45d. And as we shall see in Chapter 7, children learning English often confuse the two. Boerman, 1978. For notational and mnemonic simplicity, however, I will simply use the 6 shorthand labels in the phi-RST column of 5.31. See Miller and Johnson Laird, 1976, Talmeet, 1985, 1988, and Jackendoff, 1983, for discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of atomic and decomposed representations for causal relations. Representation 237. Another subordinating relation is intent, goal, or purpose. It is needed to capture part of the distinction between kill and murder, follow and chase, and pour and spill, and may be useful in characterizing the meanings of verbs of directed action such as tell and tell him to go, persuade, order, command, and so on. This can be represented by spelling out the goal state and subordinating it to an actional event. Since a purpose or intent event is the goal that an event is expected to cause, and a means is an event that causes a goal to come about, they might be taken to refer to the same causal link between an event and the goal that it brings about, differing in whether the cause or effect is being foregrounded. Thus they could be distinguished using opposing values of the feature less than cause focus, effect focus greater than in the feature system used for causal links in 5.31, in conjunction with a new feature called less than purposive greater than that signify s that the phi null effect in the causal chain is the goal of the agent. For mnemonic purposes, though, I will continue to call the effect focus subordinator for goals, means, I will use a mnemonic for the cause focus subordinator for goals spelled, for 2, since in English these subordinates can be grammaticized paraphrastically in purpose clauses using the complementizers for and to, e.g. Richard built the house for his daughter to live in it. A possible semantic structure for chase, a notoriously complex verb that incorporates a purpose, is shown in 5.32 with real nouns serving as mnemonic indexes. Roughly, it can be glossed as: the cat acts and goes toward the mouse which is going away from it in order to be at the mouse. 5.31. Features. Focus. Potency. Cause occurrence. Effect occurrence. Effect. Cause success yes yes. Cause, effect success yes yes, despite, effect failure yes no, but, cause failure yes no, let, cause success no yes, prevent, cause success yes no. 238, Chapter 5 5.32. Chase, for to effect toward away from such. Event, property, event, thing cat, place, be, go, path, go, think mouse, at, ACT. A phi null dimension of causal subordination, which is typically encoded in deontic auxiliaries like should or ought but may turn up in the definitions of main verbs, is obligation. Sometimes a verb might specify that an event causes there to be an obligation for one of the parties to do something in the future, as in buy or sell. Conversely, some verbs specify acts that are done to fulfill an obligation, such as reward or repay. Again, the difference is in cause focus versus effect focus, so we can again borrow the corresponding feature introduced in 5.31 and add the feature less than deontic greater than to the set, yielding the ability for verbs to specify that an event incurs an obligation or that it fulfills one. I will use the mnemonics, obligates, and fulfills, so that the depictions of the relevant subordinating linkages will be more compact and transparent. Parsimonious formalists will note that the feature system for causal subordinators has allowed for a reduction in the representational machinery from 10 primitive causal subordinators to 6 primitive causal subordination features. This also predicts that verbs in the world's languages are capable of expressing 2 6 equals 64 possible subordinating relations if no further. Representation 239 constraints are specified. Surely there are constraints on combinations. For example, goals and obligations do not seem to cross-classify in English, nor do obligations and potency, but verbs do seem able to express fairly complex relations pertaining to the attainment of means and ends, e.g., manage to, fail to, succeed at. Thus the features system's gain in parsimony for primitive symbols and its concomitant increase in the number of complex causal relations that are expressible seems to be a good trade-off. One more formal point is worth making. If acts could be embedded inside one another without limit, an infinite number of syntactically distinguishable kinds of verbs would be possible. In fact, I have found that the following 2 constraints hold for all the English verbs I have examined, some quite complex, but no more than a single kind of subordinated event is possible for any level of semantic structure, i.e., an ACT has at most 1 effect, 1 means, and so on. B. Embedding is not recursive but Degree 1, see Wexler and Kulikova, 1980. There can be only one level of subordination within an event that is itself subordinated, i.e., not at the root. I suspect that these generalizations are justifiable as general constraints. Carter 1976a was led to suggest similar ones. If so, causal subordination does not result in an infinite number of arbitrarily complex verb meanings. For example, no verb can specify an argument that is the means of a goal of an effect of a prevented action. This is not necessarily a conceptual constraint on the maximum length of a causal chain that can be encoded as the meaning of a verb, but it is a constraint on the length of the causal chain that linking rules and lexical rules ever need to look at. 5.5.12. Non-physical semantic fields for acts. According to the extension of the thematic relations hypothesis outlined in Chapter 4 in connection with passivizability, Section 4.4.4, the antagonist-agonist or agent-patient relation in acts can be analogized from the semantic field of physical force to non-physical semantic domains in the same way as the theme path or theme location relation in physical space can be analogized to non-spatial fields like possession. The choice of field can be expressed in the current notation by appending the field name to the event or state node, just as for fields based on location. Talmy hints at a social field, in which force is extended to social pressure in verbs like urge and persuade, an intrapsychic field in which different parts of the mind are pitted against one another, e.g., refrain, and an inferential field, in 240. Chapter 5, which some ideas have implications for the truth or plausibility of others, e.g., imply. Another field, which we can call responsibility, expresses relations among states that are asymmetrically responsible for the existence of other states. Finally, we can consider a psychological field, involving direct and asymmetrical relations between minds and ideas. When the phi-RST argument is a represented entity and the second an animate entity, the interpretation is of a perceived object, event, or idea impinging on the perceiver, possibly causing some subordinated event such as the perceiver changing state, e.g. the news calmed John or the percept entering the perceiver's store of knowledge. When the phi-RST argument is animate, and the second, represented, some mental activity or state of the perceiver is responsible for the idea standing in some relation to the mind of the perceiver. These of course are the two kinds of psych verbs discussed in section 4.4.4. Simplify ed entries for one of each kind of verb, learn and remind of, are shown in 5.33 and 5.34. 5.33. Learn. To in effect. Property represented. Property animate. Event. Psychological. Event. Epistemic. Think Bob. Think Bob. Think lesson. Think lesson. Place. Go. Path. ACT 5.34. Remind. To in effect. Property represented. Property animate. Property represented. Event. Psychological. Event. Epistemic. Think picture. Think Bob. Think Bob. Think Mary. Place. Go. Path. ACT. Representation 241 5.5.13. Temporal information. One more kind of information must be specified. Time. For example, the distinctions between processes and punctate events run versus sneeze and between achievements and accomplishments have not yet been given an explicit representation. Furthermore, the temporal relations among certain within verb subevents need to be expressed, such as the difference between give and send. As we shall see, these differences have syntactic implications. Many linguists and logicians have suggested a modified timeline for the representation of tense and of verbs that encode time explicitly, such as last. Events and states are located as parts of the line, and aspectual distinctions correspond to how those parts are delineated. States are processes or regions of the line with no distinct boundaries. Instantaneous events such as hitting or points, accomplishments such as drawing a circle or regions bounded at their ends by a point, achievements such as winning a race or points bounding the end of a region. More complex temporal relations, such as those effected by the addition of aspectual affixes, can also be defined in terms of the timeline representation by zooming into a point or a non-delimited subregion within a delimited region, by aggregating sets of points into regions, and so on. See, e.g., Talmy, 1985, Langaker, 1987. I will adopt. Jackendoff, S19878, suggestion that such a timeline representation serve as a separate tier in the representations of a verb, S semantic structure, mapping each event and state onto some part of it. See also Pustejovsky, 1987, 1988. A simple example is shown in 5.35 for the verbs eat as in eat the apple and break as in break the stick, which are accomplishment and achievement verbs, respectively. Large open dots signify points in time, boundaries are punctate events, thick line segments signify regions, and dashed line segments signify unbounded ends of regions. 5.35. Eat. Effect. Property. Broken. Go thing. Why. Event. Thing. Thing. Manner. Eating. ACT break. Event. Thing. Thing. Why. Event. Ident. ACT. 242. Chapter 5 5.5.14. A remark on redundancy, constraints, and decomposition. For better or worse, the timeline introduces considerable redundancy in semantic representations. Events must precede or be simultaneous with their effect, and, but, subordinate events, they must follow their, cause, and, despite, subordinate events. Purposive for 2. Substructures are interpreted as goals that precede the events they are subordinated to, themselves define it in terms of an event that would have to follow the main one if it took place. Events presumably refer to parts of the timeline designated with boundaries, states to unbounded regions. Furthermore, events bounded at their ends are intimately linked with the notion of patient and theme. Bendeler, S. 1957, examples of activity verbs were usually intransitive, his examples of achievement and accomplishment verbs usually transitive. See also Pustejovsky, 1987, 1988, for discussion of some of the connections between aspectual and thematic relations. Tenney, 1988, proposes that the internal argument of a verb can be defined as that which temporally delimits or measures out the event. She actually reverses the current perspective by proposing that the temporal aspectual representation is the interface between lexical semantics and argument structure, with the rest of semantic representations being essentially epiphenomenal. The extent to which one can eliminate components of causal, spatial semantic structure by predicting them from temporal, aspectual representations, or vice versa, is beyond the scope of this discussion. As far as I can see, we need both. For example, there are no obvious aspectual differences between roll and bleed, own and have, choose and win, or load with and phi-ll with, though they contrast in their willingness to undergo alternations. Therefore I will use both, leaving open whether possible redundancies should be eliminated, and if so, how. The need for partly redundant lexicosmantic structures may be quite general. Consider, for example, the verboseness of the semantic structure of cut in 5.27. On the one hand, there must be an explicit representation of the motion of the instrument, the effect on the object, and the contact of the instrument against the object so that various syntactic generalizations distinguishing different subclasses of action verbs, discussed in section 4.2, can apply properly. For example, the grammaticality of she cutted it requires that a rule, c, the motion and contact components of cut, s semantic structure, and the ungrammaticality of asterisk. She cut the knife against the bread requires that a rule see the effect component. That, sy it. Representation 243 wooden, t suff ec to adopt a more compact representation in which, cut, was a primitive unanalyzed term implicitly incorporating the motion, contact, and causation. This strikes me as a telling argument against the view of Fodor et al. 1980, that verb meanings are not mentally decomposed. On the other hand, a structure composed out of that many independent parts would seem to license too many verbs that probably do not exist, such as acting on. A to cause a change in. B by means of acting on. C to cause. D to move against. E. Thus we face conflicting demands. Certain rules must see the componential structure of a verb, but not every arrangement of these components can serve as a possible verb. 9. These conflicting demands suggest that we must dissociate primitiveness from constrainedness. A theory of possible verb meanings cannot simply fall out of the set of semantic primitives and the elementary syntax of their combinations. This dissociation is familiar in phonology. Phonological theories specify as an inventory of distinctive features, but not every subset of feature values is a possible segment. For example, no segment can be plus vocalic and minus sonorant. This underscores the importance of rules defining broad conflation classes, some universal, some language specify C, that license only certain subsets of the combinatorially possible configurations of semantic elements. They may do so, for example, by providing a set of intermediate-level clusters of elements whose internal structure is transparent to lexical rules but that serve as the smallest allowable building blocks of semantic structures. For example, to explain the fact that, at least in English, it is the patient that is the theme of the change when an agent physically acts on a patient and produces an effect, there could be a prefabricated conflation chunk in which the subordinated effect clause has its theme role linked with the patient of the superordinate. Similarly, a prepackaged conflation chunk would ensure that when an agent acts on a patient by means of using an instrument, it is the agent that acts on the instrument, and if the instrument moves, it is toward the patient. 5.5.15. Summary of semantic machinery. In 5.36 I list the semantic elements that I will assume lexical rules can be sensitive to. Though the inventory is more complex than the list of a half dozen or so thematic roles that previous treatments of verb semantics have appealed to, it is nonetheless quite constrained. First, in sheer numbers it is very small relative to the thousands of semantic distinctions that the 244, Chapter 5 verbs in a given language can make. Second, all of the elements have reflexes in particular closed class morphemes in many languages, and most can be found in the closed class vocabulary of English. Third, the elements define simple semantic structures that, unadorned with idiosyncratic quoted information, could serve as the meanings of light, verbs like make, be, or give. Fourth, virtually all of them correspond in a straightforward way to the meaning elements that Talmy lists as recurring across languages. Further constraints on which combinations of them are well-formed could be captured in universal and language specify. See convolution rules. The question I will ask in the next section is whether the list can delineate the phi FTY odd classes that I have suggested are the units of generalization in Baker's paradox. 5.36. Conceptual constituents. Event, state, thing, path, place, property, manner, functions expanding conceptual constituents. Plus or minus dynamic, plus or minus control features yielding the predicates ACT, go, be. Have place functions at, on, in, under, path functions to, into, toward. Features of subordinating relations. Cause focus versus effect focus, success versus failure, occurrence versus non-occurrence, purposive deontic. Properties. Animate, inanimate, human, non-human, 0D, 1D, 2D, 3D, extendedness. Representation 245 count mass rigid, flexible substance, aggregate liquid, semisolid. Temporal objects. Timeline point region. Other mechanisms. Open arguments, coindexing, semantic, filed annotation, quoted constants, manners, properties. 5.6. Explicit representations of